When thousands of able-bodied men and women lost everything they owned in a mere couple of weeks in late 1929, the general public was understandably upset. When major industries fell, millions of workers were laid off from all sectors of the economy across the entire nation. With decreasing crop prices across the nation, labor disputes, and income inequality thrust into the limelight by the advent of the Depression, disillusionment with the establishment from all parts of the political spectrum made itself heard. President Roosevelt's first response to this crisis came within the first 100 days of his presidency, first trying to restore the confidence of bankers and businessmen to stop the country's economic bleeding. What appealed to the people, however, was not Roosevelt's treatment of Wall Street. Rather, it was the New Deal's programs, like the NRA and the WPA, that sought to put people back to work and to put money in their pockets. For a while, Roosevelt enjoyed a brief period of political immortality, where his party's majority in Congress and his own personal popularity allowed him to push through virtually any policy he wanted without opposition. Roosevelt's willingness to take action, whether or not they actually helped end the Depression, made him far preferable to Hoover in the eyes of the average American. Although the changes Roosevelt brought to the White House were enough to placate some, radicals left and right continued to agitate for more, or less, reform. Some of the louder voices of the dissenters were Floyd Olson, Francis Townsend, Upton Sinclair, Huey Long, and Charles Coughlin. They represented a resurgence of the 19th century populist movements and believed that Roosevelt's attempts to save and humanize capitalism were in vain because the system of capitalism itself was fundamentally broken. Alternative platforms rose from their anger. Townsend, an aging physician, created a plan for a substantial old age pension. Sinclair, famous for his book The Jungle, campaigned for governor of California on a platform of wealth distribution and collectivism that would allegedly end poverty in his entire state. And Huey Long, governor of Louisiana and later senator, called for a radical redistribution of capital in his share his wealth plan. Regardless of the political and economic soundness of their respective plans, these radical leaders gained unprecedented support from their populace and represented growing sentiments that Roosevelt could hardly afford to ignore. Outside the political system, fiery orators such as the Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin, initially a supporter of the New Deal and an ally of Roosevelt, before turning on him, began to speak out angrily against capitalism and the Roosevelt administration after just a few years. As one of the first to realize the tremendous potential of the radio, Coughlin spread his word across the country, playing off popular anti-Semitic and anti-communist attitudes to denounce Roosevelt, and what Coughlin perceived as the president's subordination to the international banking system. Many of Coughlin's views strongly reflected those of the old populist movement, including his calls for inflation and the nationalization of major industries. Discontent came also from those most hard hit by the Depression, the urban workers and the farmers. Unions, sometimes with radical beliefs, struck for labor rights and shut down key industries until management caved. For some, notably black sharecroppers in the Old South, the New Deal only made them even poorer and exacerbated their economic plight by making them more expendable to their landlords. Coughlin and Long also cultivated the image that Roosevelt was controlled by the big business interests of America, creating even more opposition and dissent. Members of Roosevelt's brain trust recognized the threat demagogues like Long and Coughlin posed to the administration, and sought to assimilate it or defeat it. The so-called Second New Deal, the flurry of progressive legislation pushed through by Roosevelt starting in the summer of 1935, is often seen as a reaction to progressive pressure. Although many defining policies of Roosevelt's program, such as the Wagner and Social Security Acts, had been planned long before Coughlin and Long's rise to power, Roosevelt was forced to stand firm on them to make sure they could not be hijacked by radical opposition. Ultimately, the programs of the Second New Deal cannot be considered wholeheartedly progressive in nature either. Even the implementation of a progressive tax, a policy largely based off of Huey Long's Share Our Wealth platform, was eventually heavily watered down in Congress. Even the Social Security Act, the poster child of progressive reform, significantly excluded domestic workers as well as those in the agricultural sector. Unlike many of his predecessors, Roosevelt knew that he could not ignore the rising clamor for reform and government action in times of crisis. Roosevelt's significant departures from the age-old wisdom of laissez-faire capitalism, although mostly engineered by Roosevelt and his own aides, were influenced in no small way by the agitation of radicals like Long and Coughlin. At the end of the day, Roosevelt's willingness to experiment as necessary to save the country as well as capitalism meant that the New Deal did not have a single guiding ideology. Rather, it was a policy of trial and error that defined its legacy.